witchcraft. It's the all-new, fully animated movie, Scooby Doo and the Witch's Ghost.
Ghost hunting's our specialty.
My last attempt was 5 years ago when that independent article came out on the 20th anniversary. I forwarded that article. I said, listen, if it's any time to do this, it's now. And I sent them the article because they're writing articles about the Hex Girls. And never heard from him.
Some of you may remember the famous straight-to-video Scooby Doo saga in the late 90s, and these were four genuinely good animated films, largely led by Davis Doy and Glenn Leopold. But what I'm talking about today has to do with one very specific detail in these movies. A fictional all-girl rock band called the Hex Girls, and these girls were briefly featured in Scooby Doo and the Witch's Ghost. I was honored to be able to interview Rick Kopp, one of the main writers of the movie, and the creator of the Hex Girls, to explore how these girls became cultural icons and what led to their downfall. The full interview is going to be posted shortly after this one, so please consider subscribing if you want to be the first to know about it. To celebrate the 20th anniversary of Scooby Doo and the Witch's Ghost, The Independent wrote a one-off article in 2019 titled The Hex Girls: How a Fictional Scooby Doo Rock Band Became Cult Queer Girl Power Icons. The Hex Girls were on track to become a breakout success, until they weren't. If you clicked on this video, chances are that you already know who Scooby Doo is and who the Hex Girls are. I mean, who doesn't know who Scooby Doo is? But as a summary, Scooby Doo is a children's show that was created in 1969, which followed a group of detective teens and their talking dog to solve mysteries around the world. This show was so popular for being spooky for its time, because imagine all you know is the Flintstones and the Jetsons, but all of a sudden this pops up on your screen. There are parts of the show that still freak me the fuck out, and it was super innovative for its time, but the story got repetitive very quickly because the show never followed a linear storyline, and that was because there was no streaming or even VHS tapes in most households. You either caught it on TV on Saturday morning or you just didn't. So the writing was always the same for each episode to make it easy for kids to understand. The gang stumbles upon a new location that is being terrorized by an insane monster, but after about 20 minutes of running around, they find out that the monster is actually some Yahoo in a mask. So how did the Hex Girls happen? How did we even get to the famous straight-to-video saga? They were only created after a very specific turn of events. So here's what happened. So Time Warner bought Scooby Doo and everything else in the pre-1986 Hanna-Barbera library in 1991, and they did this to fill up TV slots for Cartoon Network, which was launched in October of 1992. In doing so, Warner Brothers became a subsidiary of Time Warner in 1990, and they needed to quickly find a way to revitalize Scooby Doo's image because they had this kids network that was fairly new, and they needed something fresh to show. So Warner Brothers hired an unlikely team of people to create Scooby Doo on Zombie Island. This team of incredible artists included Davis Doy, Glenn Leopold, a Japanese animation company called Mook Animation, and an alternative rock band Sky Cycle, which was featured in several songs. I mean, Scooby Doo on Zombie Island went hard.
You hear the screeching of an owl.
This film is one of the best American animated films of all time, and I know that there's a bold statement to make, but I will die on this hill. This team was given full creative control to do whatever the hell they wanted to do, and every frame and detail of this movie is a work of art, but its massive success led to inevitable corporate interventions that led to what we're talking about today. The reason why Scooby Doo on Zombie Island was such a success was not only for its animation style, music, and overall aesthetic, but it was because of a very new plot twist in the film. The monsters were real. After the film did really good, Warner Brothers decided that Zombie Island was really great, but it was too scary for kids. So they allegedly brought in writers David Goodman and Rick Kopp to make it more kid-friendly. Rick and David was a writing duo and mainly specialized in comedy for TV. And one of the notable things that they worked on was the Golden Girls, which I thought was really cool.
We were told that they wanted to bring in some writers who weren't exclusively animation writers. At the end of the day, it was a combination of both. It was us and them. So we came in and had one meeting. I pitched the title, Scooby Doo and the Witch's Ghost, because I'm from Maine. I wanted to do some New England, Salem, Massachusetts, and the Stephen King type character, and all of those elements were things that I wanted to draw from my roots.
And the way Rick explained it was that there were some projects that David would lead, and there were some that Rick would lead.
We had two projects going on at once, and it was based on a children's book called The Stinky Cheese Man. And David focused on the Stinky Cheese Man, and I took over and focused on Scooby. Although we both came back together and would go through it together. He added lots of jokes and things like that. I mean, my God, he's a great joke guy and a wonderful writer. Yeah, I just remember taking point on that script.
Aren't you glad you took point on the Scooby script and not the Stinky Cheese Man?
Well, yeah, I had to. Because like I said, I was such a huge Scooby fan. David wouldn't have dared. I'm a huge fan of the original first season. That first season, they had some really standout episodes, like the caveman and the iceberg, and my favorite was the circus one where Daphne was hypnotized and riding the unicycle. I was like, some of that stuff was, I just remember they were so I was so impressionable,
Danger prone Daphne did it again.
So I really focused on that when we sat down to plot it out, and it was scary because there was only one movie before ours, The Zombie Island, I think it was. So it was kind of a Scooby feature was a new thing. So I was very nervous. Are we going to be able to write more than like a half-hour episode? We have to make. I think that's why we kind of leaned into the twist at the end of the ghost being real, Sarah.
The first 2/3 of the movie ended in a classic unmasking that was very reminiscent of the original show. And this revealed that this Salem-inspired town collectively came together to fabricate an evil witch ghost to boost their tourism, which I thought was pretty cool, like the fact that the whole town was in on it. After the unmasking, it turns out that the evil ghost of Sarah Ravencroft is real. And to me, this aggressive twist in the movie made it really, really interesting.
We got it to a place where since we weren't animation writers, there were a lot of technical stuff so that we got it to a point where we could get it. And then Glenn and Davis, and they were the animators too, so they took it and made it better and changed some stuff.
A lot of other video essays I've seen talking about this topic assume that anything good about this film is fully credited to the original Zombie Island team. I quickly found out that this topic is a lot more nuanced than I realized, and I also realized how much credit Rick Kopp doesn't get in these video essays for his contribution to this film.
I remember we decided to make the ghost real in the end, and which hadn't really been done before. And but for some reason I think that people are saying that came in a later draft. From what I remember, I think because I remember discussing it, I said let's make it a real ghost story, because that would be a real twist on Scooby, I thought. And it did kind of last throughout all the iterations,
I want to make it really clear that the overall story of Scooby Doo and the Witch's Ghost would not have happened if it wasn't for Rick. I mean, in the interview, he talked about growing up in Maine and how he was really inspired by his roots in New England, which led to the setting of the movie. So everything from the main plot foundation to the Hex Girls was written by Rick. With that in mind, I definitely think that the work that Davis and Glenn added to the story only enhanced the overall plot. Both teams added elements to the movie that made it work. The end result was a hybrid ending of both Davis and Glenn's story and then Rick and David's story. So in my opinion, that's why I think it worked really well. I do understand where people are coming from when they criticize outsiders coming in and interrupting a team of artists who were already working together. And I think ultimately the original team would have absolutely come up with a great movie themselves. But corporate intervention aside, I think it's important to understand that Rick and David took this production very, very seriously.
Yeah, we did have the seed, and maybe, because of the first movie, I don't remember where it came from, but I do remember having the seed of like, oh, Sarah, the real Sarah comes back, and something, and then they took it and made it its own thing. Yeah, for sure. I definitely would not dispute that.
I support the idea that artists should be left alone, but two things can be true at once, and I think that when Rick was given the opportunity to work on this project, he put a lot of thought into what he was writing, and I think that he definitely needs to get credit for that. More importantly, Rick's role in this production introduced the Hex Girls.
Hit it, sisters.
Hex Girls was definitely from our script, yeah, because I needed a girl band.
Even though Rick's role in this production was a result of corporate intervention, ironically, his adamant decision to have an all-girl goth band in the movie would give Warner Brothers 3 extremely strong characters that I personally believe they did not deserve.
I even remember writing in, like, I didn't write songs, but I would say, insert song here, blah, 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 where they perform and stuff. And it was beyond, I was beyond thrilled when I saw the final product. No, I described them, I think, as goth. I think David and I, were saying, oh, they're, and they took it and really, really ran with it.
So many people loved these characters. So what made them so popular? Well, for one, their animation style was really alluring, their music was unique, and they portrayed an alternative aesthetic that felt super original and mysterious, especially for the movie's target audience.
The inspiration, when I came up with the idea for the Hex Girls, I remember coming up with the name and thinking, well, that's a cool name for a band. But I was such a huge, obsessive fan of Josie and the Pussycats. It came on a year after Scooby premiered, and it was an all-girl band that traveled around the world and got into all these spy adventures. And I own the show to this day. Whenever I get down, I pop it in I pop one up on my iPad and watch it. It makes me feel better. I was always looking to do like a Josie and the Pussycats type show, and I saw my opportunity with the Scooby script to include a girl band. Like Josie, and the fact that they recorded songs and Jane from the Go-Go's was involved as one of the voices. I just thought that was the coolest thing.
In The Witch's Ghost, the Hex Girls are introduced to these mysterious beings, leaving us, the viewers, to guess who they are in the story and if they are the villains. The gang eventually runs into them during a rehearsal where they perform the iconic song Hex Girl. I'm sure everyone's heard that song. Thorn is voiced by Jennifer Hale, Dusk is voiced by Jane Weedland from the Go-Go's, and Luna is voiced by Kimberly Brooks. At the end of the third act, the undead witch who was summoned by the antagonist can only be defeated by a true Wiccan, and Thorn in the story is described to be 1/16th Wiccan and ends up saving everyone. But it's important to understand how significant Thorn was of the Hex Girls in this particular movie. She goes from being suspected culprit to literal boss who traps a 17th century ghost and traps evil Tim Curry. Also, I love how her friends just abandoned her in this scene. Good luck, bitch! Rick Kopp wrote these characters, but the art style, voice acting, music, and everything else was executed by Davis's team, because Rick was a writer. But they're not witches or vampires, they just care a lot about the environment and dress like art students. So basically half of Gen Z on TikTok.
This is Dusk and Luna. We're eco-goths.
Eco-goths?
And we don't need your approval.
This movie features additional songs like Earth, Wind, Fire, and Air, and a song called The Witch's Ghost, which was played during the credits and is probably my favorite Hex Girl song if I had to pick one.
It's the witch's ghost. She's what we fear the most.
The Hex Girls were like an official, unofficial band. The movie soundtrack had a whopping 7 songs sung by them. 7. Also, admittedly, there were some really terrible songs, because please tell me why the Hex Girls would ever sing a song called Zoinks, Scooby Snacks, or Those Meddling Kids. I don't know who came up with that. I get that they were probably thinking, oh, what do kids want to listen to? But I think I can speak for everyone when I say that we all just wanted to listen to grown-up music. The Independent made the narrative of their article that the Hex Girls are queer icons, but Rick Kopp explains that the girls being queer wasn't a thought that he had at all. It just kind of accidentally happened.
I never wrote them as lesbians. I wasn't even in my head at the time. I guess through the animation and through the creative process, I can see how they would become queer icons,
Very soon after The Witch's Ghost movie came out, Warner Brothers quickly identified that the Hex Girls were a success. So Rick and David were brought back in to do a spin-off series, and they had several meetings about making one, but it just never came to fruition.
I remember, again, Linda Steiner, who had brought us in the beginning, brought us back in to talk about a Hex Girls spin-off, because the studio was thrilled with how well the movie was doing, and the Hex Girls were a big part of that. And we had several meetings discussing a Hex Girls series, which of course I was thrilled about, and but then it just never, for some reason, happened. And I'm sure in the intervening years, other people at the studio, other writers probably tried again because they were proving to be so endurable and popular. But for some reason, my last attempt was 5 years ago. I forwarded that article to Sam Register, who I don't know if he's still at Warner Brothers, but he was the head of animation back then, and I knew Sam. I'd known Sam for years, and I said, "Listen, if it's any time to do this, it's now." And I sent him the article because they're writing articles about the Hex Girls, and never heard from him.
Did it just stop there? There was no production or movement at all?
As far as I can tell, Linda left after that. After Linda left Warner Brothers, she went to other companies. So she was kind of the point. I remember at the time, Gene McCurdy, her boss, and they were very interested, but I don't know why it didn't. I remember the characters reappeared in several episodes, in the Scooby universe. But they never got their own show, which I think is a shame.
The Hex Girls would later appear in a few various iterations of Scooby Doo, and they would only show up in like an episode every now and then. We wouldn't see the Hex Girls until about 4 years later when Scooby Doo and the Legend of the Vampire released, and their impact to the story in that movie was underwhelming to say the least. The Scooby-Doo franchise made a bold turn immediately following the death of William Hanna and the completion of Warner Brothers fully acquiring Hanna-Barbera Productions was complete at that point, and all of this happened around the same time. It's also worth mentioning that the last Scooby-Doo movie in this famous direct-to-VHS quadrilogy was Scooby-Doo and the Cyber Chase. So this movie released in 2001, and according to Lance Falk in a 2017 podcast that I listened to, there was so much drama from corporate intervention just taking over this production that the team that originally did Zombie Island booked it. They're like, we're not doing this anymore. I am not gonna open up that can of beans about that particular production because it's pretty much confirmed that the production for that movie was hell. Instead, I'm going to link a video that Offbeat Kiki made covering this topic, and I suggest you all go watch that. There is, however, a noticeably different art style in the Cyber Chase that opted for a format that was quicker and obviously digital, and this led to a new age of Scooby-Doo. The What's New Scooby-Doo series first aired in 2002, and it gave a more modern and whimsical take on Scooby-Doo, and it featured new humor, music, and aesthetics that were very popular for the time. Scooby-Doo and the Legend of the Vampire was the first animated film Scooby had since the passing of William Hanna, and I cannot begin to describe to you all how lazy the art style is compared to the earlier saga. This is all too noticeable once the Hex Girls are introduced in the movie. On a much more serious note, I'm not even gonna beat around the bush when I say that Luna was turned into a white woman. I'm not even gonna use the term whitewash. They turned Luna into a white woman. I had to do a double take because I actually did not remember this happening. I felt like I was going crazy when I was looking at it. I'm like, is Luna white? And before anyone comes at me in the comments to argue with me, Luna was a black woman. She was absolutely a black woman. This is a picture of the original concept art drawn by Jim Stenstrom, the director of Scooby-Doo and the Witch's Ghost, and this confirms that. Turning her into a white woman, especially during a time when minority representation took a downward turn, is unfathomable to me. Aside from that whole insanity that is White Woman Luna, it was just clear that they rushed through the art compared to the other movies. As an example, just look at the text on this movie poster. It's like they typed up some default Microsoft Word font and called it a day. The Hex Girls were originally captivating due to how they were animated on stage, and Thorne's movements in particular in her 1999 iteration were much more fluid and embodied that of an occultist young woman. But in the vampire movie, their lips aren't even moving when they're singing. Even as a kid, I watched this scene and I was like, who the f are these imposters? Because they are not the Hex Girls. This is Thorne, and this is Silicone. Unlike the first movie the Hex Girls were in, the Hex Girls in this film barely add anything to the plot. I don't want to spend more time covering this movie than I have to because this movie is completely dog shit. But this movie is about an ancient mountain vampire who kidnaps rock stars and turns them into vampire minions or something. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's set in Australia, and the setting is some kind of rock festival featuring the Hex Girls as one of the acts. The most significant thing to happen to them is that they get kidnapped, and then we just don't see them for a while. But at the end of the movie, they just like casually show up and say something like, oh yeah, we were just wandering around the desert for hours, but this guy just picked us up. okay. I will say though that Jennifer, Jane, and Kimberly were still chosen as voice actresses, which I appreciate, but they still use the same Hex Girls song from the first movie, which I found out became the default thing to do anytime these girls were reintroduced. They also added one song, which doesn't even have a longer version online that lasts longer than like a minute. So it just seems lazy. They have a movie set in a rock festival in an era where movie soundtracks were actually bought by people. Yet, you didn't make an album featuring the Hex Girls? No album featuring Velma's Mariah Carey era? The next time we would see the Hex Girls would be in an episode of What's New Scooby Doo, which followed the same art style that could be quickly made for TV. And aside from Luna being violently Caucasian, the episode entitled The Vampire Strikes Back was exactly what you would expect from a What's New Scooby Doo episode. And I found the What's New Scooby Doo episodes to be a little bit more creatively written than the earlier Scooby Doo TV series, so I did quite enjoy that series as a kid. There were 2 songs featured and sung by the original voice actresses, one song being called Petrified Bride, which was fine. I mean, I don't think it sounded like what the Hex Girls would have sung, but it certainly sounded like a pop punk song from 2003. They also sang a cover of the What's New Scooby Doo theme song, and I found that to be super expected and also plain. It just seems annoying. Like, of course, you're gonna have the Hex Girls sing the Scooby Doo theme song, and then not have them sing anything else. I personally consider What's New Scooby Doo and the Vampire movie to be in the same era, so my main issue with this era is that they did not follow the source material very well, in more ways than one. There's also nothing mysterious or captivating about this version of the girls because they look and act very different. I mean, Thorn used to be cool. Dusk and Luna too, like they just had so much more attitude in the original, and that the newer versions just did not live up to that. I mean, just take this interaction, for example.
Never mind. I'll do it myself. See you in the morning. Bad dreams, sisters.
Bad dreams, Sister Thorn.
These new girls do not embody this at all. The people in charge basically removed all true edginess from these characters and said, hey, look kids, it's the Hex Girls. Remember? It's them. We promise. We have the Hex Girls at home. The Mystery Incorporated era of the Hex Girls surprised me in a good way because I had never seen this version of Scooby Doo before until researching this video, but I just thought that I would hate it. The 2010 episode, In Fear of the Phantom, opened up with the Hex Girls song again. I felt that their portrayal in that movie stayed a lot more true to the source material, even though the art style is wildly different. Do I prefer the original art style? Of course I do, but I was prepared to completely dog on this version of them. For one, they definitely embody the carefree, go-with-the-flow attitude that they had in the first movie, and the music that they chose for the Hex Girls seemed to be a lot more fitting for who they are as a fictional band, and also their overall aesthetics just felt more genuine to who the Hex Girls are. I do have to ask why they made Dusk into Temu Harley Quinn, but I guess beggars can't be choosers. I mean, what are they doing with her hair? Dusk was also a lot more crazy in this version of her, which I found surprising. I mean, she's just bouncing off the walls. And I guess that's a byproduct of the format for this particular series. I also appreciated that in the Dance of the Undead episode in 2013, they were all wearing all of their original clothes. They only appeared in these 2 episodes, and we wouldn't see the girls again until 2020 and their Scooby Doo and Guess Who era. I do have a lot of appreciation for this iteration of the series because it paid a lot of homage to the original Scooby Doo Where Are You art styles, but the Hex Girls themselves took a huge step back. It really boils down to an inaccurate portrayal of the characters. So for example, this delivery guy, he starts fangirling over the Hex Girls and he asks them to sign for like a package or something. And then Thorn kisses where she's supposed to sign. And when he asks for a picture, they all take a selfie? I don't know, this for me just gave off a vibe that they were very self-absorbed, and I don't think the Hex Girls would have acted like that. In general, they just act overly animated in this iteration of the series, which is probably to make them more consistent with how the other characters act in this version of Scooby-Doo. For me, there's a real lack of the whatever attitude in this version of the Hex Girls. Which brings me to when we most recently saw the Hex Girls, which is in the proudly canceled Velma series. Correction, we only saw Thorn. I tried watching Velma for 5 minutes, and I absolutely hated it. But I realized after doing some critical thinking that I really only hated it because of how they completely ignore the source material. I just feel like the characters themselves are so irritating. Fred, he is so irritating. He's annoying. All of their personalities just felt so inaccurate. I did laugh a few times after forcing myself to forget about who the characters were, so like there were some funny parts, I'm not gonna lie. However, that was my opinion before I realized I turned on the wrong episode that I thought had the Thorn cameo. And when I tell you that they turbulently displaced Thorn, I am not exaggerating. This to me feels like a hate crime. Not only did they age her poorly, which I would not have had an issue with if she wasn't wearing the exact same thing from 1999 and looked like she was on drugs. Velma was already a show that changed everything about the characters. I mean, Mindy, she already went off the deep end, pissing off 90% of Scooby Doo fans and burning any and all respect she had for the series. They mess with Thorn, and then they get the big cancel button, which brings us into our current and seemingly final era of the Hex Girls, which I like to call the canceled era. Do you want to know what I hate with every fiber of my being? Giant corporations merging with each other. In April 2022, Warner Media and Discovery officially merged, and this led to a lot of debt, up to 1,000 regular-ass people being laid off from their careers, and trashing perfectly good projects and using them as tax write-offs. One of these trashed movies was called Scooby Doo and the Haunted High Rise, and it not only included the Hex Girls, but it also included 3 new original songs. I don't personally know if they were all Hex Girls songs. And I'm gonna be honest with you, at this point in my research for this video, I just stopped caring about the intimate details of how the Hex Girls would have been included in this movie. Because to me, the Hex Girls were already far too gone. Let's just hypothetically say that this movie was made, right? In what world would we have gotten the magic that we received in 1999? The animation, the music, the writing, the genuine art that's well thought out. Tell me a world where this tax write-off would have actually portrayed the Hex Girls in a way that they deserved. Because for me, it's not enough for them to just show up in another Scooby Doo movie. Warner Brothers had many opportunities to make a successful spin-off series featuring these amazing characters.
I was approached by a independent producer, very well successful, and he wanted to do a Hex Girls movie, but it's like, we can't do anything without Warner Brothers.
One of the most memorable things that Rick said to me in this interview is when he said,
I don't understand why they don't know what they have.
Even that article written by The Independent wasn't enough to convince these people that the Hex Girls had so much potential. Even the smallest representation we could have had with these characters was thrown in the trash for a tax write-off. And the big people in charge don't seem to care.
They own the property, you know? And so even though I created them, I have no say in what happens to them. You know, I signed a contract.
Am I the fool? Is this hand an exorcism?